What do we mean by limits to growth, and why should we care? What's the relationship between limits to growth and veganism? Well, by limits to growth, what we mean is simply limits on the physical growth of the economy. We live on a finite planet with finite resources. The economy depends on natural resources to produce all the products that we rely on. Housing, food, computers, cars, all of these things depend ultimately on natural resources. Now, science can help here. Science can make processes more efficient. Science can discover new resources. But these resources are still finite, and so our economy must be finite as well. And why should we care? Well, we face numerous environmental crises today. Problems such as global warming, which is the best known environmental crisis, but also plenty of others as well. Peak oil, mass extinctions, soil erosion, deforestation, and so forth. The list goes on and on. All of these crises constitute limits on what we can do with the economy, how far we can go. There's only so much soil on the planet. There's only so many fossil fuels. And most importantly, for global warming, there's only so much atmosphere in which we can dump all of our greenhouse gas emissions. So, because these resources are limited, then our economy must be limited as well. Now, put in this way, it sounds like limits to growth is common sense. But limits to growth is actually a fairly controversial idea. If you asked an economist what they thought about limits to growth, they'd probably say something like, well, that's not the right way to look at it. And then they'd give you a long lecture on the history of modern economic thought. But there is a small minority of ecological economists, people such as Herman Daly, Kate Raworth, and Robert Goodland, who think that actually limits to growth is the right way to think about it, and that we should be worried about natural limits on the growth of the economy and what the economy is doing to the environment. Now, I'd love to get into a long discussion of limits to growth at this point and answer the question, are there limits to growth to the human economy? But that would be a very complicated question to address. And so in this discussion, all I want to do is ask what I hope will be an easier question, namely, are there limits to growth to the agricultural economy? Because what I am concerned with is what's the relationship between limits to growth and veganism. And limits on the agricultural economy would obviously be of most interest to us here. Well, are there in fact limits to growth of the agricultural economy? Well, here's a chart of meat production, global meat production from 1961 to 2018. And you can see that between these 2 years, meat production quadrupled. Meat production went up much faster than human population. Human population approximately doubled during this period of time, but meat production has quadrupled. So it certainly doesn't look like there are any limits to growth of the agricultural economy. It looks like meat production is going up, up, up with no end in sight. If there are limits to growth of the agricultural economy, then they must be somewhere in the future. I want to show you now a different chart. This is a chart of megafauna biomass over the last 100,000 years. This is from a paper by Anthony Barnosky. Now, megafauna are just large animals, and we're talking about large land animals here. Humans are large animals, elephants are large animals, hippos, giraffes, and so forth. All of these animals are large animals. And if you added up the weights of all the large animals on the planet, you get the total megafauna biomass. So that's what we're talking about. And I'd like to point out a couple of things about this chart. First of all, the timeline is logarithmic. We start out at 100,000 years ago. The next major marker is 10,000 years ago, then 1,000, then 100, and so forth. And this allows us to cram a lot of data into just a small piece of paper. This logarithmic timescale actually makes sense because for most of this 100,000 year period, megafauna biomass has been pretty stable. 100,000 years ago, it was 200 billion kilograms, and that's what it stayed at for about 80,000 years. Then about 20,000 years ago, there was a slight dip, and it went back down to 100 billion kilograms. That was probably because of prehistoric overkill. Humans hunted such species as mammoths, mastodons, giant sloths. All these animals were hunted to extinction by primitive hunters. And as a result, megafauna biomass actually dipped. But then it gradually came back. And then suddenly, about 300 years ago, megafauna biomass really takes off. It goes up over 7-fold in what is really a geological blink of an eye. It goes up from 200 billion kilograms to 1,400 billion kilograms. And who are all these megafauna? Most of the megafauna biomass on this planet right now is livestock, about 2/3. About 1/3 is humans. And then there's a small sliver of a percentage, maybe 1%, 3%, something like that, which represents all the wild megafauna on the planet. All the elephants, bears, tigers, rhinos, and so forth. So this huge increase in megafauna biomass is not because elephants are rampaging across the planet. It's because of humans and their livestock. Do you think this is sustainable? No, it's obviously not sustainable. And I can quickly give you 3 reasons why it's not sustainable. First of all, we are destroying wild animals. Secondly, we're destroying plants. And third, we're destroying soil. All of these constitute limits on how big the agricultural economy can get. First of all, we're destroying animals. We're increasing megafauna, but all these megafauna are livestock. The wild animals are actually going extinct because there's simply nowhere else on the planet for them to go. Practically every biologically productive piece of land on the planet that could be utilized by humans is being utilized, and as a consequence, animals have nowhere else to go. So we've got an extinction crisis. The second problem is the disappearance of plants. So what are all these megafauna eating? Well, they're eating plants, obviously. And even the carnivores are eating animals that in turn eat plants, so the whole system is based on plants, ultimately. We have a tremendous output of agricultural productivity in order to feed all the livestock on the planet and all the humans as well. But this actually has not resulted in an increase in the total plant phytomass, the total biomass of all plants. That's actually decreasing. So how much plant phytomass have we lost? We've actually lost about half of the total plant matter on the planet since the development of agriculture. Well, is this sustainable? Obviously this isn't sustainable. Eventually we're going to run out of plants, I suppose. But there's a more insidious problem here, in that also we're beginning to upset the global carbon balance. Think about it. Plants photosynthesize by taking up carbon dioxide and giving off oxygen. Animals take up oxygen and give off carbon dioxide. What would happen if you went through and destroyed, oh say, half of all the plants? Well, obviously, you'd have fewer plants to take up all this carbon dioxide. And so carbon dioxide would begin to build up in the atmosphere. Now, there's a lot of other things going on in the global carbon cycle besides just plants and animals, but this is a big part of it. Now, how important is this to global warming? Well, we've lost over 450 gigatons of carbon since the beginning of agriculture, and in fact, we've only put 300 gigatons of carbon into the atmosphere by burning fossil fuels. So yes, this is very significant. Deforestation and reforestation are significant impacts on the global carbon balance, and they have something very much to do with global warming, both in the cause of global warming and in possible solutions to global warming. But that's not all. There's another problem with our modern industrialized agriculture, and that is soil erosion. Soil is eroding 10 to 20 times faster than it's being formed on our agricultural land. Our agricultural land is hugely productive, but this comes at a cost. Soil is, in principle, a renewable resource. Topsoil is continuously being formed through the process of rock weathering. But this is not sustainable at the rate we're using it. It's clearly not sustainable. In fact, this would not be sustainable even if everyone on the planet was vegan. So we clearly have a problem. Our agricultural system is not just unsustainable, it's massively unsustainable. It's an interesting question to determine exactly what would be a sustainable agricultural economy. This would be a very complex question, but the general direction we need to go in is clear. We need to have a lot more forests, we need to have a lot fewer cows, and we need probably also some fewer people as well. But there's more to this than just saying, go vegan for the planet, and everybody goes vegan, and then problem solved. This is a systemic crisis. Our whole civilization is unsustainable. Notice, for example, that I haven't really even discussed fossil fuels. Fossil fuels are finite, and also burning them contributes to global warming. So it's clear that this is not sustainable, and yet we're continuing to do this. So what's going on? Limits to growth is a systemic crisis. There's no part of our culture or our economy that will not be affected. The only real solution to the problem of limits to growth is a smaller economy. And that's the direction in which we need to go.